They handed a dying widow a deed to a piece of frozen ground and called it charity. Everyone in that valley knew what the place was. A north-facing slope where nothing grew. A dark crack in the rock the children had named the Cold Mouth, because even in summer, the air that breathed out of it had never once been warm. A grave, dressed up in a ribbon and a signature, and they slid it across the table with the faces of men who expected to be thanked. But the girl standing beside that widow did not cry. She did not beg. She took the deed in her cracked, calloused hands, looked at the little square of useless land that was now theirs, and thought of a dead man's journal and a single word he had left unfinished 3 years before. Winter was coming down out of the mountains like a fist. The whole town was certain those 2 women would be dead before the spring. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The cold came to Winter Hollow before the snow did. It came as a smell first, iron and wet stone. That sharp metallic edge the old-timers called a frost warning. The sky had turned the color of a gun barrel sometime in the night, and by morning, the peaks to the northwest wore fresh caps of white that hadn't been there the day before. Winter did not ask permission. It simply arrived, the way all hard things arrive, without announcement, without the courtesy of a slow beginning. Nora Vance had not slept. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed she shared with her mother, the one room they would share for 5 more days before it belonged to someone else, and she watched the light change through the single warped window. The glass was old. The dawn came through it wavering, as if the whole world outside had turned to liquid. Her father's journal lay in her lap. She had not opened it. She was only holding it, the way you hold something that contains a person you can no longer reach. Not reading, not thinking, just keeping contact with the last solid thing. Across the room, Eleanor Vance was already awake. She was always awake now, ever since the cough had moved into her chest like a tenant who paid no rent and left the place in ruins. She stood at the small stove with her back turned, boiling the water she needed every morning just to convince her lungs to cooperate with the day. Her shoulders had a careful set to them, not defeated, not yet. The shoulders of a woman rationing her strength. "The meeting is at 9, Nora said. Her mother did not turn around. "I know what time the meeting is. We should go early. Take the good seats." Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "There are no good seats in that room, Nora." She wasn't wrong. The town hall was a single room that smelled of pine sawdust and old arguments. The benches were raw wood, warped green over the summer, and the space between them was so narrow a grown man had to turn sideways to pass. It was not a room built for comfort. It was a room built for transactions, the kind conducted between people who held power and people who needed something from it. They walked the 4 blocks through streets still quiet with morning. Inside, 4 men sat behind a long table at the front, men who owned things, and in the center chair sat Judge Crane, a large man with a softness at his middle that contradicted the hardness of everything else about him. His watch chain caught the pale light each time he shifted, a small gold reminder of the distance between his side of the table and theirs. Nora noticed the old man before anything else in the room, Amos Kane. He sat at the far end of the last bench, tucked against the wall where the shadow was thickest, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, a man who had worked the mines for 30 years before his knees forced him out. His chest rose and fell in the slow rhythm of sleep, but he was not asleep. Nora had known enough miners to understand the difference between a man sleeping and a man performing sleep. The stillness was a little too deliberate. She filed it away and took her place beside her mother. Judge Crane cleared his throat. The sound filled the room the way water fills a jar, completely, leaving no space for anything else. Eleanor, not Mrs. Vance, not the widow Vance, just Eleanor. A first name stripped of its title, its protection, its inherited right to be spoken with respect. The board has reviewed your situation, with winter coming, and your current lack of means. We cannot have you continuing to occupy the cabin. It's needed now. Eleanor's voice came out small and careful. Where will we go? The judge gestured toward a map pinned to the wall behind him, the easy gesture of a man who had performed it many times, for many different recipients of many different forms of bad news. We are not without charity. The board has deeded you a plot, 3 acres at the edge of the territory line. It is yours, free and clear. He said it with the warmth of a man presenting a gift, and the 4 men at the table arranged their faces into expressions of solemn generosity. Nora looked at the map. She knew that plot. Every soul in the valley knew it. The Scarp, a north-facing slope of loose rock and stunted juniper, so steep that nothing useful grew there, and nothing sensible could be built. No timber, no pasture, no water, except the violent snowmelt that carved new gullies through the shale each spring. Its one feature was a dark gash in the rock face near the top, a cave mouth, perhaps 10 feet wide, that the children had named the Cold Mouth, because of the icy breath that sighed from it, even in summer, because standing inside it, even on the warmest afternoon, felt like pressing your face against something that had never, in its entire existence, been warm. The board had given them a place to die. They had dressed it in the language of charity, tied it with the ribbon of a legal deed, and they slid it across the table with the faces of men who expected to be thanked. Nora stepped forward. It was a small movement, barely a shift of weight, but it altered something in the geometry of the room. She took the deed from the judge's outstretched hand. Her calloused fingers did not linger on his soft ones. She looked at the little square of useless land that was now theirs. It was a grave. She understood that clearly. But she also understood something else. Something that had come to her in the dark hours between 2 and 3 in the morning, while sleep stayed stubbornly away. She had been to that hillside before. Her father had taken her there. "We thank you," she said, because it cost nothing, and it closed the conversation. Then she walked her mother toward the door. She had almost cleared the threshold when she heard it. 5 words, muttered low, aimed with precision. The kind of words spoken by a man who has calculated the exact volume needed to reach one set of ears, and no others. "Your father knew that place." Nora's hand found the door frame. She turned. Amos Kane's hat was back down over his face, his chest rising and falling in that slow performance of a man asleep. But by the time she drew her next breath, he was already moving. A large shadow detaching from the back of the room, slipping through a side door she hadn't even noticed was there. She stood with the deed in one hand, and a question that had no answer yet. Outside, the road climbed out of the valley, and the town began to fall away behind them. And without her permission, Nora's mind pulled her backward. She was 14 again, her father's hand in hers, leading her down into the mine for the first time. The shaft descended at a steep angle, and the air changed as they went deeper. This was the thing she had never expected. It grew warmer. She had assumed the earth would be cold. It was the opposite. Far down, her father stopped. He turned off his lamp, and the darkness was not an absence of light. It was a presence, something with weight, pressing against her eyes. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Just listen." So she listened, not with her ears. There was nothing to hear. She listened with her skin, the deeper layer of it, the one that reads temperature, not as feeling, but as information. And slowly, she felt it. Warmth, not the warmth of a fire or another body, something older than that. Heat that had been gathering for longer than human memory, stored in stone that came before every living thing. A few feet down, the temperature barely changes, he told her. Summer, winter, it makes no difference down here. The surface is a liar, Nora. It shouts about heat and cold. But this deep, the earth tells the same story all year long. He pressed his hand flat against the rock. That's what's down here, the earth's memory of warmth. Then he had gone quiet. That inward look, the one he got when he was working through something he wasn't ready to say out loud. That land north of town, the hillside with the cave, everyone says it's worthless. A small private smile. But I see something a shout from deeper in the shaft, and the sentence ended, the way too many things with her father ended, in the middle, before the point. Now, walking the road to the scarp with her mother's arm in hers, Nora understood what she had not understood at 14. Her father's sentence had an ending. He had seen something in that hillside, not just potential, but a specific kind, the kind that needed a certain literacy to recognize. The deed was not a random cruelty. It was an inheritance, delivered by the wrong hands, for the wrong reasons, landing on the right person 3 years too late. And somewhere behind them, an old man had vanished through a side door, carrying a piece of the answer. The approach to the scarp took the better part of an hour on a good day. This was not a good day. The road was rutted and soft from the week's rain, and Eleanor needed to stop twice, each pause marked by the cough that had made itself so thoroughly at home in her chest. Nora steadied her mother on the loose gravel and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The land was worse than memory had promised. The slope was carpeted in sharp, shifting rock that slid beneath every step. The wind ran across it without obstruction, carrying a cold several degrees deeper than the valley below. The stunted junipers between the rocks had been shaped by decades of that wind into things that looked less like trees and more like creatures trying very hard to leave. The cold mouth waited exactly where memory had placed it. A dark horizontal gash in the rock face, perhaps 10 feet across. Thorny brambles had grown thicker across the entrance since she'd last been here, reaching from both sides like fingers laced together. She pushed through them and stepped inside. The shift was immediate. The wind cut off completely. The air went still, and carried a dampness that held the smell of deep stone, not the sharp mineral smell of a quarry. Something older than that, more patient, the smell of rock that had been in contact with darkness for a very long time. The light from the entrance fell away quickly. The space ran back perhaps 30 feet, then narrowed to a crack too small to enter. Nora wet her finger and held it up. A faint current moved across her skin, flowing from the interior toward the entrance. The cave was breathing. Her father's words surfaced whole from somewhere deep in her memory. The mountain breathes. She sat at the entrance and opened the journal. The pages were filled with her father's handwriting. Precise, angular, the careful script of a man who had learned his letters in a one-room schoolhouse and made each one deliberate ever after. The diagrams were meticulous, cross-sections of stone, timbering plans, drawings of air moving through passages, marked with small arrows, like the paths of things too shy to be seen. He had been, she thought, a kind of poet, a man who experienced the physical world in terms of forces and resistances, and the slow drama of heat moving from one thing into another. She turned the pages slowly, careful with them, careful the way you are with the handwriting of someone who will never write again. And then she found the page, a diagram of a passage driven into a hillside, and beside it, in his small, careful hand, the mountain breathes. In summer, the cool air inside flows out, a gift to the hot day. In winter, the warm air wants to rise, but a long, gentle slope holds it. The stone is a miser. It keeps every degree of warmth. A fire at the mouth is waste. A fire deep inside, with a long chimney, teaches the smoke a lesson in generosity. She read it twice. Then she looked at the cave with different eyes. The plan assembled itself, not slowly, all at once. Certain kinds of understanding arrive less like building and more like recognition, as if the answer had always been there in the materials and she had simply aligned herself to see it. They would seal the entrance, a wall of wood framing a door and a single small window. The heat would not come from a fireplace. It would come from a trench, long, running from a firebox set deep inside, beneath the floor, all the way to a chimney at the far end. The hot breath of the fire would travel that full length underground, surrendering its warmth to the stone, and the stone would surrender it upward through the floor until the floor itself became a radiator of slow, steady heat. What escaped the distant chimney would be cool, spent, nearly invisible, having paid its debt in full. It was the thinking of a miner, not a carpenter. It had been born below ground. When she stepped back outside, she found things that had not been there when she arrived. A set of mining tools arranged neatly on a flat stone, a pickaxe, a short-handled shovel, an iron chisel, old, worn to the shape of long use, but sharpened with care. She stood very still for a moment. The hillside was empty. The wind moved through the junipers. No footprints she could read on the loose rock, no sound but her own breathing. She crouched to examine the pickaxe and found what she was looking at before she understood she was looking for it. A particular angle of wear on the blade, the evidence of a specific way of drawing a file across steel. She had seen that angle once before, on the tools her father kept on hooks in the corner of their kitchen. It was a method passed between men who had worked the same stone learned through years of standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark, never taught with words. Someone who had worked beside her father had been here, and beside the tools, drawn in white chalk on the surface of the stone, an arrow pointing into the cave, and next to the arrow, a number, 2 degrees. She looked at it for a long moment. She did not understand it. Not yet. An arrow and a number, and no explanation. A message from someone who assumed she would already know the language it was written in. She filed it into the back of her mind, where it would wait until she had earned the context to understand it. Then she picked up the pickaxe, tested its weight in her hands, and carried it inside. The doctor met her on his porch rather than inside, which she understood to mean that the news would not be improved by comfortable seating. He was thin in the way of men who have always considered eating an interruption to more important work. His spectacles sat on the very tip of his nose, perpetually threatening to fall. "Your mother's lungs are badly compromised." His voice was clinical, the way the kindest doctors learn to be clinical, removing his own feeling from the words so that hers could stay intact. "The tissue is scarred. If she spends the winter in cold, in damp, in smoke, she will not see the spring." Nora did not flinch. "What does she need?" "Warm air, dry air, clean air. Not warm for an hour and cold for 3. Consistently warm, consistently clean. The whole winter through." He removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I don't know what your plan is for that hillside, but those are the requirements. If you cannot meet them, bring her to me. I'll find space." He turned to go inside, then stopped, with his hand on the doorframe. The posture of a man who has decided, after a moment's thought, to say one more thing. "Your father came to see me once, a few years back. He wanted to know how the air in a mine affects the lungs, whether a person could live underground, without harm to their breathing. He had theories about moving air through stone, about keeping it dry. Very precise theories." A pause. "I believe he found his answers. The mine took him before he could use them." He went inside. The door closed, and Nora stood on the porch as the afternoon light flattened toward evening. What settled over her was not comfort. It was something more useful. The understanding that what her father had left in that journal was not a record of things observed. It was a blueprint, designed for this, designed for her mother, designed for the exact necessity the doctor had just described, in the language of lungs and tissue, where her father had written it in the language of heat and moving air. He had been building something. He just hadn't finished. She had a handful of weeks to finish it for him. That evening, in the cabin, they would leave in 5 days. She told her mother everything. Eleanor listened without interrupting. This was not typical. Eleanor Vance had opinions, and was accustomed to sharing them, which meant her silence was its own kind of statement. When Nora finished, the quiet that followed was not the quiet of consideration. It was the quiet of fear. "You're talking like your father." The words landed the way blunt objects land. "Your father had ideas about the earth, too. Very beautiful ideas. Very precise ideas." Eleanor's voice had a tremor beneath it that had nothing to do with the cough. "And the earth took him anyway. This isn't a mine, Nora. It's a hole in the ground." Her voice rose, and the rising brought the cough. "Always. The rising brought the cough. A full minute of it. Racking. Gray. That left her breathless, and the color of ash. When she could speak again, her eyes were wet. I would rather die with people around me than die alone in a cave. You won't die. Your father said things like that too. The words hung between them in the candlelight, sharp as broken glass. And neither of them spoke for a long time. The candle threw long shadows against the wall. The wind pressed at the cabin. And Nora looked at her mother's face, at the architecture of it, and understood something she could not have put into words before that moment. This conversation was not about engineering. It had never been about engineering. It was about whether the voice of a dead man could still be trusted to keep the living alive. Then Eleanor straightened in her chair. Something resolved in her face. Not confidence, not peace. The particular look of a woman who has reached the bottom of her options and found there a decision instead of despair. Give me until the middle of winter. If the cave isn't livable by then, truly livable, warm and safe, we go back. We accept whatever help is offered. A pause. Even the Reed boy. Nora opened her mouth, closed it. The middle of winter, she agreed. That night, she lay awake in the dark, and for the first time since the plan had arrived, fully formed, in the cold mouth of that hillside, she let the doubt in. Not speculation, genuine doubt. The architectural kind. The kind that doesn't attack the plan from outside, but from within. Finding the joints. Asking whether they'll hold. What if her reading of the journal was wrong? What if the stone was not what her father had catalogued? What if the trench was simply not long enough? What if she was only a girl of 17 with a dead man's pickaxe and a theory inherited from a man whose theories had not, in the end, saved him? She reached for the journal in the dark. Opened it near the back where she knew a page had been damaged, where something wet had fallen on the ink long ago, blurring the words into a gray wash she had never been able to fully read. She couldn't read it in that darkness. She didn't try. She simply pressed her hand flat against the page, feeling the ridges where the ink had dried. Feeling the places where her father's pen had pressed hardest. And she did the only thing available to her. She chose to believe. The morning they left the cabin arrived without ceremony. They loaded their few possessions onto a handcart. Bedrolls, a crate of potatoes and dried beans, Eleanor's quilts, and the collection of her husband's rock samples, which she had kept, because she could not bring herself to strip a dead man of his only hobby. Eleanor paused in the doorway for a long moment, looking back into the room. Her husband's work boots stood in the corner, where they had stood for years, because moving them had always seemed like a declaration she wasn't ready to make. Nora did not look back. She was already measuring the angle of the slope in her head. They passed the general store. The Reed boy was on the porch. Of course, he was on the porch. Arms folded, watching. Elias Reed was 19, tall through the body, but not yet grown into his own height. His face occupied that uncertain ground between the boy he had been and the man he was still deciding whether to become. He had offered her a room once, behind his father's store, warm and dry, worked the counter a few hours a day to cover the cost. She had said no. She hadn't softened it, hadn't complicated it with gratitude for the effort. She had simply closed the door on it, with finality, and something had shifted behind his smile. something that lived in close proximity to rage without quite arriving there. "When you can't take it anymore," he called now, pitched just loud enough. "The store is always open." Eleanor's grip on her daughter's arm tightened. They kept walking. Elias Reed was not a cruel person. He was something more complicated than cruel, which made him, in some ways, harder to navigate. He was a person who measured his own worth entirely by how much other people needed him. His mother had died when he was young, the same rattling cough that now lived in Eleanor's chest, and his father, a man of few words and fewer feelings, had taught him the lesson that hard towns tend to teach. You are either useful or you are invisible. He had spent years trying to be useful. He stocked shelves, extended credit, remembered names, delivered goods in the rain. And in return, people nodded at him, said his name. It was not love, but it was the closest thing he had. And Nora had refused the one thing he knew how to give. She had looked at his usefulness and turned it down as though it were nothing. He did not have the words for what that did to him, but it had done something. The road climbed out of the valley. Eleanor coughed on the steeper sections, the dry rattle that had become the constant percussion of their lives. Above them, the gray sky held its snow in reserve, waiting for the right moment. The scarp opened before them. The loose rock, the wind, the junipers trying to leave. The tools were still there on the flat stone. Nora set down her end of the handcart and walked to the pickaxe. She lifted it, tested the weight through both wrists, felt the balance of a tool that had been used by someone who knew what they were doing and cared enough to keep it sharp. The chalk mark was still there. 2 degrees. She looked at it once more. Then she turned to the work. Eleanor had begun to hum. A simple melody, a half-remembered tune from her own childhood. The kind of song that has no real origin. It simply exists, passed from one set of hands to the next, worn smooth by the passing. She hummed it while she unpacked the handcart, while she carried the bedrolls through the brambles into the dark mouth of the cave, while she set the crate against the stone wall and stood a moment in the dim stillness of their new home, looking at the cave that everyone in Winter Hollow had agreed was a place to die. Nora positioned herself where the trench would begin, about 8 feet inside the entrance. She gripped the pickaxe in both hands, raised it over her shoulder, and swung it into the packed earth. The impact rang through her arms like a struck bell. The vibration ran from wrists to elbows to shoulders in one sharp message. I am not interested in being moved. She pulled the pick free, reset her grip, swung again. The first inch of earth took 20 minutes. The earth did not want to be moved. That was the first lesson, and the beginning of everything. The floor of that cave was not soil in any ordinary sense. It was compressed history, layers of clay and shattered stone, fused together under the weight of ice that had retreated before human memory began. It had not been disturbed in longer than anyone alive could measure, and it intended to keep that record intact. Each swing of the pickaxe sent a shock wave up through the handle, into her wrists, into her elbows, arriving finally at her shoulders as a dull declaration of resistance. Every shovelful of debris weighed more than seemed fair. She learned this the only way foundational lessons get learned, not through instruction, through consequence, through the specific education that comes when your own body is the instrument of measurement. She found a rhythm by the third day, not because the work grew easier, because her body stopped negotiating with it. She rose when the pre-dawn light turned the entrance from black to charcoal. She worked until the darkness made the trench impossible to see against the cave floor. 12 hours. Sometimes more. She stopped measuring time by the clock and started measuring it by body lengths. Her own frame laid down in the dirt, serving as the unit of progress. 1 full length of trench per day when the earth was kind. Half that when the pickaxe rang against buried granite with a sound like a door slamming shut. Her hands changed. The soft places hardened. The blisters rose and broke and rose again and finally gave up and became something tougher. She stopped noticing the ache in her shoulders, the way you stop noticing a sound you have heard for too long. Eleanor worked beside her when the cough allowed, which was less each morning. She mixed clay and water into the thick paste that would seal the stones of the flue, her thin arms trembling with the effort of stirring something that had the weight of wet concrete. When her arms gave out, she gathered flat stones from the scree outside, moving slowly across the loose rock with the careful deliberateness of a woman who could not afford to fall. She selected each stone by hand, by weight, by flatness, by the way its edges related to the edges of its neighbors, and rejected any that would not sit flush. It was painstaking work. It left no visible monument, and without it, nothing would stand. On the morning of the 4th day, something happened that Nora did not at first understand. She arrived at the trench before dawn, as she always did, lifted the pickaxe from where she'd leaned it the night before, positioned herself at the leading edge of the excavation, and found 2 feet of fresh dug earth that had not been there when she'd set the tool down. She went very still. Then she crouched at the edge of the new section. The work was careful, competent, done by someone who understood how to read compacted earth, where to set the point of the pick for the greatest effect, how to use the natural fault lines in the stone rather than fighting them. The angle of the marks was familiar, in a way she could not quite place, the same as the sharpening on the pickaxe blade. She stood, looked toward the entrance. Nothing moved in the pre-dawn gray. Only the wind, working the junipers, only the pale edge of the coming light. She picked up the tool where the unknown hand had left it, settled into the stance, and continued from where the other person had stopped. This happened again and again, 4 more times over the following 2 weeks, always in the hours before she woke, always exactly 2 feet, never more, never a note, never any sign of who had come in the dark to give their labor, without being asked or thanked. The progress it created was the difference between possible and impossible. The math of the project, which had always been brutal, shifted slowly towards something that could be finished by the deadline her mother had named. Nora did not mention it to Eleanor. She understood, without needing to reason it through, that acknowledging the help would mean identifying the helper, which would mean a conversation she was not yet ready to have. But she thought about it. In the long hours in the trench, with nothing but the ring of steel on stone for company, she thought about the 2 feet of earth, about the tools left on the flat rock, about the chalk mark and the sharpening, and the way the pick had found the fault lines, the way her father's hand would have found them. Someone was helping her build her father's cave. Someone who had known her father. someone who did not want to be seen. On the afternoon of the 9th day, her pickaxe broke through a layer of gravel, and the sound changed from the dull thud of clay-bound earth to something cleaner, almost resonant, like the difference between striking wood and striking stone of a certain density. She dropped to her knees and cleared the debris with her hands until the surface was exposed. Red sandstone, layered with dark veins of shale, the two materials alternating in thin, precise bands. She had seen this exact composition before, on the shelf where her father kept his labeled samples, the small collection he had gathered over years of reading the rock around this valley, the way other men read the newspaper. The label on that sample, in his careful print, had read, "Sandstone and shale. Thermal retention excellent. Slow conductivity. Ideal for sustained heat." She sat back on her heels, the piece of sandstone in her palm, and the weight of it was not only physical. Her father had not merely known about this hillside in the vague way a miner knows his territory. He had prospected it, taken samples, analyzed their properties, cataloged their fitness for a specific purpose. This purpose, this trench, this system she was building now, according to specifications he had written down years before, she understood what she was reading. The scarp was not worthless land. It was land whose value required a particular kind of literacy to see, and the men who had handed it over as a death sentence had simply lacked the words. She sat there for a long moment, in the dim of the half-dug cave, holding a piece of stone her father had known was here before she was old enough to understand him. It was a strange thing to feel accompanied by someone who was gone. She set the stone carefully beside the trench, picked up the pickaxe, and returned to work. The judge came on horseback one gray morning. He rode up the slope with the careful authority of a man who owns the ground his horse walks on. He sat in the saddle for a long moment, long enough that Nora, working waist-deep in the trench, felt his shadow before she heard the horse. He looked down at the scene below him with an expression that could not settle on a single interpretation. The cave mouth, the trench running from it like a surgical incision, the spoil piles rising on either side, and the girl, her arms moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has stopped performing labor and become it. "What in God's name are you building, girl?" She looked up. The morning sun put him in silhouette, the light forming an unintentional halo around a man who believed in his own benevolence. "Our hearth." He stared at the trench. "You're digging a ditch." "Yes." The leather of his saddle creaked as he shifted his weight, and then he told her about the board's retained rights, about a clause, hazardous structures, fire risk, collapse risk, anything that might be judged a danger to public safety. His voice had the tone of a man discharging a duty he found distasteful, but necessary. "You understand what I am telling you. That deed came with conditions. If the board decides what you are building here is a danger to yourself or to anyone else, the board can take this land back, deed or no deed, and there will be nothing you can do about it." She told him she understood. He waited for more, for an explanation perhaps, or the gratitude of someone who recognizes that a powerful man has troubled himself to ride uphill on her behalf. When nothing more came, he studied her a moment longer. There was something in his face then that had not been in the town hall. Not concern. Something closer to unease. As if the sight of a girl waist deep in a ditch she believed would save her mother had touched a place in him he preferred not to have touched. He did not like being contradicted by facts he could not see. He turned his horse toward town. But he had planted something, and they both knew it. Now there were 2 clocks running, the cough in her mother's chest, and the patience of a man who had already decided how this story should end, and did not care to be proven wrong by a 17-year-old girl with a dead man's notebook. The story he carried back traveled the length of Winter Hollow before noon. The widow's daughter was digging a long ditch in front of a cave, lining it with stones, calling it a hearth. The whispers gathered momentum, the way whispers do when they find willing carriers, losing precision, gaining embellishment, arriving at their various destinations as something between a joke and a warning. Vance Folly, someone called it, pleased with the sound of it. Others used less generous language, words that carried, in a single syllable, the suggestion of animals living in the dark. They said the girl had lost her reason to grief, that she was digging toward her father, that the winter would settle the question soon enough, and settle it quietly, the way winter settles things. Nora heard none of it. She was in the trench. Kindness arrived quietly, and from an unexpected direction. Ruth Barlow came to the creek below the scarp on a gray afternoon. She stood on the opposite bank with a cloth bundle and the expression of a woman who has made a decision she knows could be argued against. She was a woman with a kind face, a face that broadcast whatever it was feeling, which, in a town that prized stoicism, had always been a slight disadvantage. She thrust the bundle across the distance between them, without preamble. Wool yarn, a tin of lard, half a loaf from that morning's baking. Josiah doesn't know I'm here. He would be angry. Nora's first instinct was refusal, clean and absolute. She had built a wall of self-reliance around herself and her mother, the same way she was building the wall across the cave, stone by stone, with intention. Because it was load-bearing. Taking charity felt like removing one of those stones, creating a gap through which something more dangerous than cold could enter. Then she thought of Eleanor's shawl, worn thin at the shoulder, where the mending could no longer keep up with the wear. She took the bundle. "Thank you." Ruth's face relaxed. "I watch you from my kitchen window every morning." A brief pause, something working behind her eyes. "I've never seen anyone work like that, not even the men in the mine." She left quickly, a woman returning to the approved world, before it noticed her absence, and Nora stood at the creek bank, holding the bundle. And something shifted in the locked place she had been carrying since her father's funeral, not breaking open, nothing so dramatic, just moving. The way a door moves when the latch is old and the house has settled. Quietly, almost by accident, just enough to admit a fraction more light. Josiah Barlow came a few days later, a mule-drawn cart loaded with good lumber, straight-grained, seasoned for a year, the kind of material that represents real investment in both money and time. He walked beside the cart rather than riding, which Nora recognized as the gesture of a man arriving as a peer rather than as an authority on horseback. He was a builder, broad and solid, with 3 decades of physical work behind him. His hands were the hands of a man who understood wood the way a sculptor understands clay. He found her setting capstones on the first completed section of the flue, with the precision of someone assembling a mechanism, not just a channel. She was covered in clay from knuckle to shoulder. She moved with the deliberate economy of a body that had learned to stop spending energy on anything that was not strictly necessary. He removed his hat, and his voice had the particular gentleness of a man who believes he is about to prevent a catastrophe, and is uncomfortable with how much it will require him to say. He described a lean-to he could build, south-facing, set against the rock wall, a proper stone fireplace laid correctly, warm, dry, sound. The kind of thing a builder builds when he wants to demonstrate care. Then he told her about a family in the next valley. Years ago, 3 of them, a shallow cave, a fire lit inside, and no understanding of what the smoke would do when it had nowhere to go. He had been the one called to bring out the bodies in the morning. The child was 6 years old. His voice dropped into a different register when he said it. Not the register of a builder's authority, something that had been carried a long time in a place that did not have a name. The same age as my daughter. Nora listened to every word. She did not dismiss his experience or his grief. She let it sit between them and gave it the respect it deserved. Then she knelt beside the completed section of the flue, struck a match, lit a handful of dry juniper needles she kept for testing, and placed them in the firebox at the near end. The smoke did not rise. It did not billow into the cave. It was drawn downward, into the stone-lined trench, with a sound like an intake of breath, low, resonant. The unmistakable signature of moving air, doing exactly what the journal had promised it would do. Both of them watched the smoke disappear into the earth. Josiah's jaw tightened. That's just wind. The difference in temperature between the air in the flue and the air at the chimney end creates a draw, and the length of the passage gives that draw more pull than any vertical chimney you have ever built, because the pull gathers over the whole run, instead of spending itself at the opening. She met his eyes. Your fireplaces lose most of their heat straight up the flue. They pull cold air in through every gap in the wall to replace the warm air they push out. You are not heating homes, Mr. Barlow. You are heating the sky. He searched her face for doubt. It was a thorough search. It found nothing. That's poetry, he said quietly, not physics. My father spent years reading this rock. She held his gaze without heat, without pride, only certainty. I am only reading his notes. The silence between them had the quality of 2 people standing on opposite sides of a canyon, each certain that the ground beneath their own feet is solid. He replaced his hat. He said he would leave the lumber anyway, and his voice, when he said it, carried the particular gravity of a man saying something he believed would one day serve as a eulogy. He walked back toward town, his shoulders set in the posture of a craftsman who has done his due diligence, who has warned the reckless and will not be blamed for what the reckless bring upon themselves. Nora looked at the stack of good lumber he had left behind and understood, without any satisfaction at all, that she would use every board of it, not for the lean-to he had imagined, but to seal the cave he was certain would kill them. She turned back to the trench. Behind her, the light was beginning to fail on the valley. Ahead of her, 30 more feet of stubborn earth waited between the fire and the far wall, and somewhere in the dark that was coming, a hand she had never seen would dig another 2 feet before dawn. She raised the pickaxe and swung. By the time the trench had crossed the middle of the cave floor, the work had become a kind of prayer. Not the kind spoken with words, the kind made with the body. Swing and clear, swing and clear. A rhythm so deep it had stopped being effort and become simply the shape of her days. 35 feet of the flue were finished now. Lined, capped, sealed with the sandstone and shale, packed tight with clay that had dried to the hardness of old mortar. And at the far end stood the chimney. 3 feet of careful stonework, each joint sealed with the precision the journal had specified. It had taken 2 full days to build. It would take 8 minutes to destroy. Elias Reed came in the dark. He came up the slope with a bottle already mostly empty. And he moved with the particular unsteadiness of a man navigating not just bad footing, but something happening inside him that his legs had not been consulted about. He did not entirely know why he had come. That was the truth he would carry down the hill afterward and never say aloud. He had told himself he only wanted to see it. The famous folly. The ditch the whole town was laughing at. But underneath that was something older. Something that had been sitting in his chest since the morning she walked past his porch and refused the one thing he knew how to offer. She had not needed him. And a man who has built his whole self out of being needed does not know what to do with that. He had grown up learning a single hard lesson, that a person is either useful or invisible. He had chosen useful. He had made himself useful to everyone in that valley, 1,000 small ways, for years. And a girl of 17 had looked at all of it and said no. He stood over the chimney stack, and through the thin leather of his boot soles, even through the whiskey, he felt it, warmth, rising from the earth beneath his feet, gentle, steady, coming up through 35 feet of buried stone that had been quietly gathering heat for weeks. The system was working, even half-finished, even untested at full strength. The thing she had built was doing exactly what she said it would do. He could feel it in his own 2 feet, in the cold dark, with the empty bottle hanging from his hand. She had been right, and something about being right made it worse. Because if she was right, then the offer he had made her, the room, the warmth, the work behind the counter, had been nothing she needed at all. He had held out the one thing he had, and she had built something better, alone, out of a hole in the ground. He kicked the stack once, testing, twice, harder. The third time was something else entirely, an act with no relationship to logic or strategy. It came from the place in a person where the unexamined pain lives, the place that has been told its whole life that usefulness is the price of being seen. The stones scattered, the clay joints cracked. 2 days of careful work collapsed into a pile of rubble in the dark. He stood over what he had done, and he waited for the relief that should have followed. It did not come. What came instead was a hollowness so complete it had its own texture. The specific emptiness that follows an act committed not out of strength, but out of the absence of it. He sat down on a rock near the ruined stack for a long time. The bottle ended up broken somewhere nearby. And when he finally left, his boot prints were pressed deep into the soft earth beside the rubble. The distinctive tread of a specific pair of boots, sold from a specific shelf, in a specific store. He did not think about the prints. A man in that state rarely thinks about what he leaves behind. Nora found the destruction in the earliest light, before even the pre-dawn gray had fully arrived. She stood before it for a moment that stretched. Her body was very still, the stillness of something about to break, or something choosing not to. The trembling in her hands was not from the cold. She looked at the scattered stones. She looked at the cracked joints. She looked at the 2 days of work, undone in the night by someone who had walked up here for the express purpose of undoing it. Then she looked down, at the boot prints pressed deep in the soft earth. At the broken glass, the label still partly legible. And she understood what she was looking at. She was not certain. There was a difference between those two things. And the difference would matter later. Eleanor appeared at the cave entrance, saw the rubble, saw her daughter's face. Who did this? Not with anger, with the practical urgency of someone who wants to know what kind of problem they are dealing with. Nora did not answer. She crouched. She gathered the scattered stones into a pile, one at a time, with hands that had stopped trembling. And she began, again, from the beginning. There was no speech in her about justice, no vow of revenge muttered to the dawn, only the picking up of stones, which was, in its way, the most frightening answer she could have given. That afternoon, she walked into town. The bell above the store door announced her. And when Elias looked up from the nail bins he was sorting and saw her standing in the doorway, something passed across his face. Not guilt, not in its simple form, the more complicated expression of a person bracing for a specific kind of impact that he believed he had earned. I need wire and hinges. Her voice was level. Her face disclosed nothing. I'll pay with labor. 1 day in your stockroom. Elias blinked. He had prepared himself for accusation. He had steeled himself for it, all the way through the sorting of the nails. He had rehearsed his denials. He had readied a face for her fury. He had not prepared himself for commerce. I thought you didn't need anyone. I don't need charity. I'm buying supplies. She said it the way you state the weather. And then she waited at the counter for him to fill the order. He filled it. His hands were not quite steady. She worked his stockroom the following day. 8 hours, organizing inventory with the same systematic precision she brought to everything. And Elias found himself unable to stop watching from behind the counter. He had imagined many versions of how this encounter might go. He had lain awake imagining them. The accusation, the fury, the satisfying storm of a person wronged, which he could have argued against, could have pushed back on, could have used to feel like something other than what he was. He had not imagined this version. The version where she treated him with the polite, businesslike neutrality one extends to a stranger whose feelings are beside the point. The absence of anger was worse than anger would have been. It told him, clearly, that she had seen what he had done, that she understood exactly what had driven him to do it, and that she had weighed all of it, and concluded he did not merit even the energy of her contempt. That was the thing that undid him. Not that she hated him, that she did not consider him worth the trouble of hating. She left without a single word about the chimney. She did not look back from the doorway, and he stood there among his shelves in the warm store his father had left him, feeling colder than he had felt standing over the rubble in the dark. She rebuilt the stack in 2 days. This time, the stones went below grade. Set in clay, at a depth no casual boot could reach. She laid heavy, flat rocks across the top as a second layer of armor, each one requiring both hands to lift into place. The labor was almost identical to the first time, but something inside it had changed. She was not simply building now. She was building against the knowledge that the world contained people who would unmake her work, if given the chance, which meant the work had to become unmakeable. There is a bitterness that can come into a person at that discovery. The discovery that effort alone is not enough, that you must also defend the effort, that the world will not simply let a good thing stand because it is good. She did not let the bitterness in. She let it make her more careful instead. Every stone set deeper, every joint sealed twice. She turned the wound into engineering. When it was done, she pressed both palms against the surface and felt nothing move. The crisis that nearly ended everything did not announce itself. It never does. She was excavating the final stretch of the trench, the last few feet, near the chimney connection. The end was close enough now that she could see it, could almost feel the finished shape of the thing, the way a traveler feels a destination before the road reveals it. And then the pickaxe broke through a layer of gravel, and water began to seep in. Not a rush. Nothing dramatic enough to call an emergency in those first moments. Just a slow, patient upwelling from below, as if the earth had been waiting for exactly this, waiting to reveal what it had been holding in reserve, all this time, beneath the one place she needed most. She watched the water level rise. Within an hour, 2 inches stood in the bottom of the trench. She crouched, and she observed it, with the careful attention her father had taught her. The observation of someone trying to understand a system, not merely react to it. And what she understood made her go cold. Water in the flue meant steam when the hot gases passed through. Steam meant heat scattering into the air as moisture, instead of sinking into stone. The whole system, all the feet of it, already finished. It would fail. Not partly fail. Fail completely. Because the entire principle depended on one thing, that the stone stay dry. She had accounted for compacted earth. She had accounted for buried granite. She had accounted for sabotage in the night. She had not accounted for a hidden seam of groundwater sitting just below the gravel, exactly where the last section of flue needed to run. She sat down in the trench, her legs in the cold water, her wrists resting on her knees. And for the first time since the plan had arrived, fully formed, in the cold mouth of that hillside, the architecture of her determination developed a crack, not a collapse, a crack, running through the load-bearing wall, the kind of crack that does not announce failure, but raises the question of it. She was so close. That was the cruelty of it. Not that she had failed early, when failure would have cost her little, but that she had come almost all the way, spent nearly everything she had, and the earth had waited until then to show its hand. Eleanor was watching from above. She had seen her daughter's back through every kind of difficulty these past weeks. The back of exertion, the back of fury after the sabotage, the back of exhaustion on the nights the work ran past moonrise. She had never seen the back Nora was showing now, the back of a person who has run out of the thing they have been running on. And Eleanor, who had spent her worst nights being cared for, understood in that moment that there was nothing she could carry up the hill, no bundle, no yarn, no bread that would help. The only thing that could help her daughter now was already in the cave. Nora reached for the journal. The pages were damp from the air in the cave, and she handled them with the involuntary reverence of someone touching something irreplaceable. She turned to the damaged page near the back, the one where moisture had fallen on the ink long ago, blurring the words into a gray wash she had never once been able to fully read. She had pressed her hand against this page in the dark weeks ago and chosen to believe. Now she needed it to speak. She tilted the journal at an angle, positioning it so the thin afternoon light coming through the cave entrance struck the surface at a shallow rake. Light reveals the shape of a landscape by catching the edges of small things that are invisible when the sun is high. It did the same now to the ink, and the letters emerged from the blur, like shapes rising out of fog. Grade the floor, 2 degrees. Water follows gravity, not hope. She read it twice, and the number sat in her chest like a struck bell. 2 degrees. The chalk mark on the rock outside the cave entrance, the day they arrived. The arrow pointing inward, and beside it, that number, left by whoever had also left the tools. Whoever had known enough about this exact place to anticipate this exact problem before she had even broken ground. Someone had tried to warn her. Before it happened, she simply had not yet had the context to understand what she was being warned about. The message had been waiting for her all this time, on the rock and in the ink both. 2 hands reaching toward her across time, her father's, and another she had not yet named. She sat with that for a moment, the strange, aching comfort of realizing you were never quite as alone as you believed. The solution was simple, in the way the best solutions are simple, not because they take little effort, but because they stop fighting the world and start agreeing with it. A gentle slope in the floor of the trench, 2 degrees, running from the firebox toward the chimney end. It would guide any water that seeped in downhill and out, where a narrow channel cut along one side could carry it away from the system entirely. Gravity would do what no amount of effort could sustain across a whole winter. The problem was what it required. To grade the floor, she would have to open every sealed section she had already finished, adjust the level of the entire trench, relay every stone, reseal every joint. Every foot of work she had already done had to be done again, better. She looked at the flooded trench, at the 30-odd feet of finished flue that now had to be torn open and rebuilt, at the deadline pressing closer, at the sky outside, which had been building something for 2 days. And she felt, for one long moment, the full weight of it. Then she stood up, because that was the only move the situation allowed. She spent the next 2 days in a state of labor that had passed beyond exhaustion into something else, something that felt, strangely, like clarity. Each section she reopened was a conversation with her past self, correcting errors she could not have known to avoid, undoing her own careful work so she could redo it correctly. There is a particular loneliness in that, in destroying something you built with your own hands, because you finally understand it well enough to know it was wrong. She worked through it. Her hands cracked. She wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept working. She slept in short, hard pieces and rose in the dark and picked up the shovel again. And on the afternoon of the second day, she made the final cut in the drainage channel. She watched the accumulated water begin to move, slowly at first, then with the quiet conviction of something obeying a law, rather than making a choice. It ran downhill, and away, following the grade her father had calculated in a notebook she had almost not been able to read, solving with geometry what she had tried to solve with effort alone. She set down the shovel, and she walked out of the cave. She sat on the cold ground outside the entrance. The light was failing in the west, going the colors of bruised copper. The valley below was filling with the early dark, and she could feel the water running away beneath her, following the grade, obeying the law. The tears came without announcement, not from sadness. She was past sadness. The way you get past a country you have been traveling through for far too long. They came from somewhere deeper and less legible, from the place where the body keeps track of what the mind refuses to count. Weeks of it. The weight of the deadline, the sabotage, the groundwater, the cold that never once relented, the cough she heard through her sleep, the specific loneliness of doing something that no one around her believed was possible. "I'm so tired, Pa." The words came out smaller than she intended, addressed to the failing light, to the cold ground, to the journal she was no longer holding. And Eleanor came out without being called. She moved slowly across the rock to where her daughter sat, lowered herself down with the careful economy of a body that had learned caution, and put her arm around Nora's shoulders. She did not speak right away, because she was a woman who had learned the difference between the silence that abandons and the silence that stays. After a while, into the quiet, she spoke. "He used to cry, too." Nora went still. "Every evening, after his shift, he thought I didn't know. He would go out to the back step and put his face in his hands, and I would hear him through the kitchen window." A pause. "And every morning, he went back down into that mine." Nora said nothing. She did not need to. She needed only to know that the man whose calculations she was staking her mother's life on had also known what it felt like to reach the end of his strength and get up anyway, that the journal was not written from a place of effortless mastery. It was written from the same grinding daily choice she was making right now. The physics on those pages had been paid for, in private tears, on a back step, in the dark, by a man who was afraid and went to work regardless. The physics was inherited. The stubbornness was too. "He would not have wanted this to break you," Eleanor said quietly. "He would have wanted it to become you." The first star appeared in the strip of sky above the ridgeline. Nora looked at it for a moment. Then she stood up, went inside, and returned to work. The cave was sealed a full stretch of days before the deadline her mother had named. The wall across the entrance was built from the good lumber Josiah Barlow had left, supplemented with salvaged planks Nora had carried up the slope, board by board, over 3 separate trips. She framed the opening with care. She left space for a door built from double planks, and for a single small window. The glass for that window cost her something. She traded her mother's silver brooch for it, completing the transaction without a word to Eleanor until the glass was already set in its frame and the trade was beyond undoing. Eleanor looked at the window for a long moment. Her expression was not what Nora had braced for. "He gave me that brooch," Eleanor said, "the year before you were born. Then he would have approved." Eleanor said nothing, but she reached out and touched the glass. As if touching something, the light passed through. She built the first true fire on a still, cold evening. A small one. A handful of dried juniper branches, placed in the stone firebox with the care of someone lighting something that has waited a very long time to be lit. The match caught. The kindling took, and the draw happened immediately. That low, resonant pull, the sound of the whole system working exactly as the journal had described, the smoke vanishing into the earth as if the mountain had chosen to inhale. Not a wisp of it entered the room. For 3 hours, nothing else happened. The fire burned. The air in the cave stayed cold. Nora fed the firebox in measured amounts, small additions, at precise intervals, and waited, in the specific silence of a person who has bet everything on a principle they have never once been able to fully test. Eleanor sat wrapped in her quilts. The cough came and went. Nora lay on her bedroll well past dark, listening to her mother's breathing, and then she felt it, not in the air, through the bedroll, through the stone beneath it. A warmth so faint it could have been wishful thinking. She pressed her palm flat against the cave floor, moved it a few inches along the buried path of the flue. The warmth was stronger there. Another few inches, stronger still. The stone was charged by the passage of hot breath along its full length, and now it was giving that charge back, slowly, upward, through the packed earth, into the room above. The thing her father had designed was accepting its first full load, and beginning, quietly, to pay it out. She looked at her mother. Eleanor was asleep. Her breathing was steady and clear. The kind of breathing a body makes when it is not fighting for air, but simply using it. No cough. For the first time in longer than Nora could remember, no cough accompanied the act of her mother's sleeping, and Nora lay there with her palm flat against the warm floor, and felt a relief so complete it bypassed every ordinary category of feeling, arriving, instead, somewhere close to grief, because it had cost nearly as much. Then it settled into what it actually was, and she closed her eyes, and for the first time since the cold came, she slept without the unfinished thing sitting on her chest. The doctor came a few days later. He stood inside the sealed cave for 2 full minutes without speaking, which, from a man of his economy, was the equivalent of a long speech. He touched the wall. He crouched and moved his palm across the floor in a slow arc, measuring the gradient of warmth the way a physician measures a pulse. He examined Eleanor, listened for a long time, had her breathe deep, breathe slow, cough deliberately into the warm, still air. When he folded his instrument away, he looked at Nora with an expression she would remember for a long time, because it contained, for the first time from anyone in that valley, respect, not sympathy, not pity, not the complicated regard of someone watching a person do something unwise with great determination. Simple respect, the kind extended between people who understand the same thing. Her lungs are healing. The air in here is warm, dry and cleaner than any house in the valley. He picked up his bag, and at the door, he paused. Your father would be proud. He left without looking back. Outside, the sky to the northwest had been building something for days. High, thin clouds, stacking above the distant peaks in a particular formation that people who live in hard country learn to read, the way sailors learn to read the swell before the sea shows its hand. Then, one strange afternoon, the cold broke. The air turned soft and generous. Too soft, too sudden. The kind of warmth that arrives like a stranger with an easy smile and something to sell. Down in the valley, people opened their doors, turned their faces up to it, told each other spring was coming early. Nora stepped out onto the ledge above the valley, and the warmth felt wrong. She breathed in and caught it, a faint metallic edge to the air. The thing her father had written about in the safety notes near the front of the journal. The particular signature of pressure falling faster than it should. When the air empties out like that, he had written, it means the world is getting ready to become something else. She went back inside. She checked the woodpile. More than enough, stacked past what seemed sensible, because something in her had insisted on it weeks ago, and she had learned to trust that voice. She checked every joint in the sealed wall, pressed her fingers into the moss-packed gaps, felt for drafts that were not there. She checked the draw, holding a lit splinter near the firebox, watching the flame lean steadily inward. Everything was ready. She did not know for what, only that the softness in the air was a lie, and that whatever the sky was building behind that easy blue, it was nearly finished. She sat down by the fire and listened to the draw take the flame. Whatever was coming, it would have to get through the stone first. The storm came down out of the northwest like a wall of dark, not a cloud, a discontinuity, a hard edge between the world as it had been and the world as it was about to become. It crossed the valley faster than anything had a right to move, and the soft, generous warmth of the afternoon, the stranger with the easy smile, turned out to be exactly what Nora had feared it was. A lie, a salesman's promise, meant to catch the maximum number of people out in the open, coatless, believing. The wind arrived before the snow, which gave it the quality of a warning no one had time to act on. And then there was no longer any meaningful difference between the ground and the sky. Inside the cold mouth, the storm arrived as sound, a low, sustained roar. The character of weather not as a passing condition, but as a new and permanent state of the world. Through the sealed wall, it was muffled, reduced to a pressure rather than a specific noise. The candle on the table burned straight up. The air in the cave held still, protected by more than walls, protected by mass, by weeks of careful fire stored in stone that did not experience urgency, and released it now with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Eleanor sat across the table, her knitting needles moving at their steady rhythm. The yarn was the wool Ruth Barlow had carried down to the creek on that gray afternoon, worked now into a shape that was beginning to resemble a garment. She had not coughed since morning. Nora set 3 small branches in the firebox. The draw took them with that low, resonant pull she had long ago stopped noticing. The way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. Present, reliable, simply part of being alive in this place. The smoke went into the earth, and the earth kept its end of the agreement. Eleanor set down her needles. It sounds angry out there. It is. A pause. The needles resumed. Are you worried? Nora held the question up against what she knew. The floor warm beneath her feet. The wall at her back, unmoved. The fire drawing clean. The fuel stacked past any storm of ordinary length. She thought about the word, what it would mean, what it would ask of her. if she let it in. "No," she said, and the word came out without the effortful quality of reassurance, which was how she knew it was true. But down in the valley, the word had a different weight. Down in the valley, worried was not enough of a word. The finest built cabin for miles belonged to Josiah Barlow, raised with 30 years of craft and the best materials a man could buy. And the storm found every weakness that skill alone cannot erase. The gap where two log courses meet. The joint around a window frame where the chinking had compressed over 3 winters. The threshold under a door that fit perfectly in the warm months and had shifted with the cold. Through each of these, the storm inserted itself, and with it came the fine, dry snow, settling on the floor, on the furniture, on the backs of hands, as if the outside had simply decided to come in and stay. Josiah fed the fireplace 3 logs at a time. The fire roared with the theatrical vigor of something burning everything it had, and 10 feet from its mouth, the air was still below freezing. He counted the woodpile. He did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was a cold and honest thing. Morning. Possibly, if the fire burned as hot as it burned now, and the storm did not worsen. After morning, the furniture. After the furniture, the floorboards. His boy lay on the cot nearest the fire, wrapped in everything the house could offer. He had woken that morning with a fever, the ordinary kind, the kind that broth and rest resolve under ordinary circumstances. These were not ordinary circumstances. His breathing had gone shallow and fast, the sound of a small body working harder than a small body should. Ruth pressed a cloth to his forehead with hands that had developed a fine tremor she could not control, not from the cold, from the specific terror of watching a child struggle and being able to do nothing about it. Their daughter sat beside her brother with her hand over his, old enough to understand that the grown-ups in the room were afraid. Josiah stood at the woodpile and counted again, as if the number might have changed. Then he looked at his wife, and Ruth was watching him with an expression he had not seen in all their years of marriage. Not accusation, not blame, just the quiet, unbearable clarity of a woman who had done the same arithmetic, who understood what her husband's hands had built, and what they had failed to build. He had gone to that hillside with a cartload of good lumber. He had told the girl she was building a death trap. He had walked away, shaking his head, in the posture of a man who had discharged his duty to the reckless. The fire ate another log, and gave back a fraction of what it took. The town meeting, when it happened, went the way emergency meetings go, when the emergency has already arrived. Full of plans too late for the crisis in the room, suggestions that required resources the crisis had already consumed. The judge talked about organizing a party to bring in wood. The men did the arithmetic on the depth of the snow, and the arithmetic won, the way arithmetic tends to. It was Josiah who stood up, because he could not think of anything else to do. There's one place that may still be warm. He did not have to say where. Every man in that room knew where. Several of them had used the words Vance Folly in the past weeks, and a few of those men were looking at the floor now, rather than at Josiah. The judge's answer came from the comfortable certainty of a man who has not yet been required to test his assumptions against the physical world. They can't have survived. Not up there. Not through this. And that was when the old man stood. Amos Kane rose from the back corner of the room. The movement had the quality of something geological, slow, inevitable, preceded by nothing that could have predicted it. He had not spoken at a town meeting in years. He was a fixture, present, unremarkable, neither consulted nor excluded, simply there. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, but it carried the weight of a man who has spent a lifetime learning to tell the difference between what he knows and what he merely believes. The girl is alive. The room went still. Her father understood how to live inside stone. His daughter understands it too. I have seen what she built. He looked around at the frozen faces, the desperate ones, the faces of men who had mocked a 17-year-old girl into a hillside and were now being asked to go to her for rescue. "I'm going up. Barlow, are you coming?" Josiah was already reaching for his coat. The way up was a punishment, snow that reached their chests in the deep sections. They broke the path with their own bodies, which is the least efficient way to move through deep snow, and the only way available to them. Josiah was younger, stronger, driven by the specific fuel of a father's fear. The image of his boy's flushed face, the shallow breathing, the arithmetic of the woodpile. Amos moved with the deliberate, mechanical patience of a man who had spent decades doing hard things in places where panic is the most dangerous thing you can bring. Josiah fell the second time on a stretch that had drifted especially deep, and when he went down, his legs did not answer the instruction to rise. The cold had been working on him for a while now, and the cold had been thorough. He lay in the drift, and the whiteness around him had a quality he recognized with the part of his mind that stays rational even when everything else is failing. The quality of comfort. It would be easy to stay here, not pleasant. Nothing about his situation was pleasant, but easy. In the way surrender is always easy, requiring nothing, costing nothing further. Then a hand closed around his collar. The grip was not the grip of a man that age should have been capable of. It was the grip of someone drawing on a resource that was not located in muscle. "Get up." The words were not gentle. Not yet. It was a command, issued by someone who had given this command before, in darker places than this, and had been obeyed. Josiah got up. They crested the final rise, and Josiah saw the chimney stack first, barely visible above the snow line, a small stone column that should have been buried, but wasn't, because she had built it tall enough. Above the stack, a thread of warmth rose into the frozen air, barely visible against the sky. The ghost of heat that had traveled the full length of buried stone before it reached this exit point, and behind it, through the small window of the sealed cave, light, not the desperate yellow of a fire struggling against the cold, the steady, warm amber of a controlled interior. He raised his hand and knocked. The door opened inward, and the warmth that came through it was not a blast. That was the first thing his body registered, because he had braced for a blast. The aggressive exhalation of an overheated room. What came instead was an embrace, warmth from every direction at once, from the floor beneath his feet, from the walls on either side, from the very air, which had a quality of saturation, not hot air, warm air, thoroughly warm, the way the inside of a living thing is warm, because the warmth came from within the structure, rather than from a single burning point at one end of it. Nora stood in the doorway, A wool dress, no coat, no shawl, her hands not cracked with cold. She looked at Josiah with an expression that held none of the things he had braced himself to find. No triumph, no vindication, no carefully hidden satisfaction at being owed an apology. She looked at him the way you look at a person who is suffering, and whose suffering you understand. He stepped inside. He turned slowly, his mind trying to reconcile what his senses were reporting with any category of shelter he had available. He pulled off his gloves. His fingers were white, stiff, the joints barely answering, and he raised his hand and pressed his palm flat against the cave wall. The raw rock, uninsulated, the surface that, in any understanding he possessed, should have been the coldest point in the entire room. It was warm, not dramatically warm, not unnaturally warm, warm with the specific quality of something that has been warm for a long time and intends to remain warm. A deep, structural warmth that did not come from a source you could point to. That came from the material itself. He kept his palm there, and the understanding that moved through him was not the fast understanding of an argument won or lost. It was the slow understanding of physical evidence, the kind that does not care about your opinion. That simply is, the way temperature simply is, the way stone simply is. He had spent 30 years building structures that fought the winter. By burning more fuel than the winter could steal, he had believed this was the best answer, because it was the only answer he had ever been taught to give. He had not been a master builder. He had been a man who had mastered one limited approach to an unlimited problem. "My boy is sick," he said, and the words came out in fragments, because the full sentence required a kind of admission his body was still resisting even as his mouth made it. "We have no more wood." Nora looked at him. She looked at him for a moment long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be a mercy. "Then bring your family here," she said. "There's room, and it's warm." She loaded a small sled from her own woodpile, enough to keep the Barlow cabin survivable for the length of the journey down and back. Not a gift she could easily spare. She gave it anyway. Josiah took the rope, and at the door, with his back to her, because he could not turn around and say this to her face, he spoke. "You were right about all of it." Then he walked into the white. The family arrived that evening. Ruth came through the door first, their daughter in one arm and her free hand guiding the boy, who moved with the limp consciousness of a child whose whole body has been occupied with the work of a fever and has nothing left for anything else. His face was flushed a deep pink that had nothing to do with the cold, his breathing audible from across the room, and Eleanor was already at the cot before Ruth had fully entered. She moved with a speed and certainty her daughter had not seen from her in months. The quickness of a woman who has identified something she knows how to do. She laid the boy down, placed her hand on his forehead, read what she found there with the calm of someone who has been in this exact place before, and knows that the calm is part of the medicine. She wrung cloths and water heated on the firebox, laid them on his chest, replaced them as they cooled, with fresh ones, working with the steady repetition of a woman who understands that healing is mostly persistence, mostly the willingness to keep doing the right thing, past the point where it seems to be working, until it does. And she sang while she worked, a simple, repeating melody, the same half-remembered tune she had hummed on the day they first climbed to the cave. a song with no particular meaning beyond the meaning that nearness and repetition give to sound. The boy stopped fighting the cot. His breathing slowed. His hand came up and found the edge of the warm cloth on his chest. Ruth sat across from Eleanor and watched, her hands folded in her lap with a tightness that was the only visible sign of everything she was holding. And at some point, in the long middle of that night, she reached one of those hands across the cot and laid it over Eleanor's. Eleanor did not stop what she was doing. She held Ruth's hand and continued her work and continued her song. And the two women looked at each other in the warm cave above the sleeping child. And whatever passed between them in that look required none of the words neither of them quite had. They were mothers. That was vocabulary enough. And there was a thing happening in that room that no one named aloud. The woman lying at the center of all this care was the woman a doctor had once told to prepare for the worst, the one who had been carried up this hill, who had coughed the color of ash, who had said in a candlelit cabin that she would rather die among people than alone in a cave. She was not dying now. She was saving a life. The warm, clean air her daughter had built for her had given her lungs back to her, and she was spending them, breath by breath, on a song for someone else's child. Nora watched from across the room and felt something move in her chest that had nothing to do with warmth or physics or the success of a system built from a dead man's notes. Her mother had come here to die, and instead, the cave had given her back to the world with something left to give. That, Nora understood, was the thing her father had actually been building. Not a shelter, a future. Elias Reed arrived on the third day. He came without announcement, without the performance of ease that had always been his default. The man who stepped through the door of the cold mouth bore the same name as the one who had leaned against a porch post weeks ago, watching two women walk out of town. But the resemblance ended there. This man was thinner through the face. His eyes moved in small, uncertain arcs instead of that calculating steadiness. His hands had a tremor that was not from the cold. The room went quiet in the particular way of rooms where people know something the newcomer does not know they know. Ruth Barlow looked at his boots, the specific tread of a specific pair, the same pattern she had seen weeks ago pressed into the soft earth beside the ruined chimney stack. She looked at Nora, and Nora shook her head. Once, minimal, absolute. Ruth looked back at Elias, at the silent way he stood in the doorway, at the specific quality of a person carrying a debt he cannot find the words to name. And she understood. Some reckonings do not happen in words. They happen in the slow, unglamorous work of becoming a different person than the one who did the thing. Nora crossed the room to him. She looked at him for a long moment, reading the pressures beneath the surface the way her father had taught her to read stone. Not the face, what the face was covering. She saw the boy who had once stood beside a sickbed, listening to a rattling cough. She saw the scattered stones in the dark, the broken glass. She held both things at once, the harm he had done, and the harm being done to him. And she felt, in herself, the resistance she had not acknowledged until now, the part of her that wanted to use the door as the instrument it could be, to close it in his face and let the cold have him, and call it justice. She let that part exist. She looked at it without flinching. Then she looked at his face again and made the choice that costs more than anger, because anger, at least, is a kind of energy, and this was something else. "Is your father all right?" Elias's mouth opened. Nothing came out for a moment. "I don't know. I have to go to him in the morning. I'll give you wood for the trip." He sat down heavily against the warm wall. The collapse was not physical. His body stayed upright. What collapsed was something structural in the way he had always presented himself to the world. Some load-bearing beam that had been under strain far longer than he had ever admitted. The tears came without sound, which meant they had been accumulating behind a very controlled surface for a very long time. And no one in that warm cave said a word. They simply let him weep, in the heat that a girl he had wronged had built, beside the fire he had once tried to destroy. Outside, the storm went on, throwing itself against the mountain, and the mountain, as it always had, simply held. The storm spent its last strength against the mountain on the third night, and when it was gone, the silence it left behind was the silence of a world scoured clean of sound. Morning came with a sky so clear and cold it looked like polished steel. The valley below the scarp had been remade. The familiar shapes of the town reduced to soft suggestions under drifts that swallowed fences whole, rooftops rising from the white like islands. A whole geography rewritten in a single night by something that did not care what it erased. But the cold mouth stood warm. 14 people had come through the storm inside it, and every one of them was breathing. That was the arithmetic that mattered now, not the one Josiah Barlow had done at his woodpile. This one, Elias Reed left before the others woke. He carried his father down the hill on a sled. The old man bundled in everything the store had contained. The journey took hours through snow that had compacted just enough to be crossed, and not enough to be easy. He fell twice. The second time, he stayed down long enough to become aware of the choice he was making by getting back up. Not a heroic choice, not a dramatic one, simply the choice to continue, in the absence of any reason compelling enough to justify stopping. He got his father to warmth. He got him to the doctor. And the old man's cough, which had frightened Elias so badly because it wore the exact shape of a sound from his childhood, turned out to be a thing that warmth and rest could still reach. His father would live. And Elias, standing in the doctor's crowded front room with blood dried in his gloves, understood that he had spent the worst night of his life carrying a man up and down a mountain, and had not once thought about whether anyone would see him do it. That was new. For a person who had measured his whole worth by who was watching, that was something close to a miracle. The town that came out of the storm was not the town that had gone into it. The comfortable certainty that had defined the place had been burned along with the furniture. People who had spent weeks laughing at a ditch in front of a cave found the laughter had gone strange in their mouths, because the ditch had held, and the finest cabin in the valley had not. 2 names would not answer when the town counted itself. An old man caught between his cabin and his barn. A woman who had gone out into the white looking for someone she loved, and found only the storm. The valley grieved them the way small places grieve, quietly, completely, with casseroles and long silences and the particular ache of knowing everyone who was gone. But it also did something it had not expected to do. It looked up the hill, at the thread of warmth rising from a small stone column, at the amber light in a window set into rock, and it began, slowly, to change its mind about what it had seen. The judge came to the cold mouth when the roads had cleared enough to allow it. He came on foot, carrying his hat in his hands. There was something in that detail alone that said more than any speech. A man who had ridden up on horseback to warn her about hazardous structures, now climbing the same slope on his own 2 feet, hat in hand, like a supplicant. He placed a document on the table without ceremony. 10 additional acres surrounding the scarp, deeded free and clear, and in the margin, in his own hand, a single line, with the gratitude of the board. He did not stay. He did not offer the word apology, because some men are not built with access to that particular vocabulary, and Nora understood this without requiring it to be different. But there was a thing that hung in the air of that warm cave, unspoken, that both of them felt. The claws he had held over her, the hazardous structure, the danger to public safety, the thing he had ridden up to threaten her with. That thing had nearly killed the whole town. Not her ditch, his certainty, his comfortable, well-fed conviction that he already knew how the world worked, and did not need a 17-year-old girl to teach him otherwise. The folly he had mocked had held 14 people through the dark, and the fine, sound, properly built homes he had approved and admired his whole life had failed. He did not say any of this, but he knew it. She could see that he knew it. It was there in the way he held his hat, in the way his eyes moved across the warm stone walls, and could not quite settle. He accepted the silence she gave him, the same silence she had once received from him across that long table. Then he went back down the hill, a smaller man than the one who had climbed it. The crates began appearing at the cave entrance when the worst of the winter had passed. Wire, hinges, nails, a bag of good mortar, materials from the store's inventory, delivered without invoice, without a note, without anyone ever standing at the door to be thanked. Nora used every bit of it, without comment. She never mentioned the crates to Elias, and he never mentioned them to her. They had developed without any explicit negotiation a fluency in a particular dialect. The dialect of things understood, but not spoken. He was not trying to buy her forgiveness. She understood that. Forgiveness was not a thing that could be bought, and he had stopped believing it was owed to him. He was simply doing the one thing he had always known how to do, being useful. But he was doing it now for no audience, for no nod, for no one to say his name. He was doing it because a thing had been broken, and he wanted, quietly, for his hands to be among the ones that helped rebuild. That was the difference. And it was the whole difference. Josiah Barlow came back one evening when the snow had gone from everything but the highest ridges. He sat at the small table across from Nora, and they shared the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something together that they have not yet found the words to discuss. Then he asked the question he had carried up the hill. "Why didn't you make me understand?" There was no accusation in it. It was a genuine inquiry, the question of a craftsman trying to find the exact place where the error occurred. "When I came with the lumber, when I told you it would kill you, why didn't you force me to see it?" Nora considered the question with the care it deserved. "Because I didn't know how to trust anyone," she said. "I only knew how to trust stone." Josiah was quiet for a moment. And I only knew how to trust wood. They looked at each other across the table. Two people who had spent their lives in conversation with different materials, who had developed different fluencies, and who had arrived from opposite directions at the same winter. Josiah reached out. He picked up a spent match from the table, and on the frost of the window pane, he drew a frame, solid, properly joined, the kind of thing his hands knew how to make in the dark, and beneath it, a horizontal line running toward a distant point, a flue, his craft, married to her physics. Neither of them named it, but Nora tilted her head, just slightly, and Josiah adjusted one line of the drawing to match, and Nora moved her finger across the glass, changing the angle of the buried channel. It was not his invention. It was not hers. It was the thing that two kinds of knowledge make when they finally stop trying to convert each other. Amos Kane had been watching from his corner. He had come through the storm with the others and simply stayed. There was nothing waiting for him down the hill. And there was warmth here, and a girl who reminded him of a man he had loved and a purpose he had been carrying alone for far too long. He waited until Josiah had gone, until the cave was quiet in the late evening, until Nora sat alone at the table with the journal and the last of the day. Then he reached into his coat and placed a stone on the table beside her cup. Red sandstone threaded with dark shale, small enough to close a hand around, worn smooth by years of handling, not the smoothness of water or wind, the smoothness of a specific, repeated gesture, the unconscious fidget of a man working something in his pocket year after year, the way another man works a coin. Nora picked it up. She knew the composition, the same formation she had dug out of the trench, the same material her father had labeled as ideal. But this particular stone had been carried by someone else. "He gave it to me," Amos said, and his voice came out rough, as if the words had required more than ordinary effort to reach the air. "The week before the shaft came down. Said to hold on to it. Said it was the future." A pause. I didn't know what he meant. His eyes moved to her face. "I understand now." And there it was, the last thread, pulled loose at last. "You left the tools," Nora said. It was not a question. "The chalk mark, the 2 feet of earth, before I woke." Amos did not deny it. "Your father and I talked about this hillside more than once. He'd solved the water on paper, years before you ever put a pick in the ground. 2 degrees. Follow gravity. Don't fight the water." His hands rested on his knees. Still. "I could have handed you the answer. The day you arrived. I could have told you everything he told me, and saved you every hard night of it. Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because if I'd handed you the solution, you would have built his cave." He looked around at the walls, at the door with its tight-fitted frame, at the floor that had been warm beneath 14 people while a storm tried to erase the world. "This is yours. He gave you the knowledge. But you made the thing." Nora held the stone. It was warm from his pocket, and it would grow warmer in her hand, and it would hold that warmth for a measurable time after she set it down, which was, after all, the whole point, the central property of the material, the foundation of everything she had built. She closed her fingers around it, and she did not say anything, because the stone had already said what needed to be said. It was in that quiet with the stone warm in her hand and the old man watching, that Nora finally understood the journal completely. She had read it as a technical document. She had pulled from it specifications, measurements, angles, materials. She had followed it the way you follow a set of instructions. But sitting there in the warm cave those instructions had produced, she saw it for what it had always been. Every calculation about the way stone holds heat had been a man saying, "I want you to be warm." Every note about draining the water away had been a man saying, "I will not let this drown you." Every specification for the choice of stone had been a man saying, "I will not leave you without what you need." He had known his lungs were failing. He had felt the mind taking him, one shift at a time. And he had done the only thing a man like him knew how to do with love. He had written it down in the only language he trusted himself to be fluent in numbers, in angles, in the slow physics of heat moving from one thing into another. Because he understood something that most people never learn. That love, to be of any use at all, must be made transmissible, must survive the death of the person who felt it, must arrive intact in the hands of the people who need it long after the hand that wrote it is gone. It was not a set of instructions. It was a 40-page letter. And she had been living inside the answer to it all winter long. The years that followed did not arrive with drama. They arrived the way years do. One season folding into the next, the snow going and coming and going again. And the thing Nora had built spread, not through announcement, through arrival, through people coming to the valley expecting one kind of town and finding another. They came expecting cabins chinked against the cold. They found homes built into hillsides, half buried in the steady temperature of the earth, heated by long channels that ran beneath stone floors and gave their warmth to the bones of the house before releasing spent air through distant chimneys. The buildings were Josiah's in their carpentry, square, sound, correctly joined, and they were Nora's in their design, turned toward the earth rather than against it. People who slept on warm floors in the deep of winter called it a wonder, and Josiah, when they asked him how it was done, answered the same way every time. "It's what happens," he would say, "when two people who understand different things about the same problem finally stop trying to change each other's minds." Elias Reed changed the way most people change. Slowly, with considerable difficulty, without any single moment that could be pointed to and named. He kept the store. He grew leaner in the face and quieter in the eyes. He became a man who looked at things a little longer before drawing his conclusions. The old performance of easy charm was gone, and he did not miss it. What replaced it was better. He became reliable. In the deep, unglamorous way, a man becomes reliable when he has finally stopped needing to be seen doing the right thing, and started simply doing it. The crates never stopped coming, season after season, long after anyone remembered why they had started. He never spoke of the chimney he had broken in the dark. He did not have to. He had spent years answering for it, in the only currency that ever mattered. Not words, not apology. Repair. Amos Kane spent his last years in the corner of that warm cave. A man who had finally set down something heavy he had carried for a very long time. He had kept a promise for a friend. He had watched that friend's daughter finish what the friend could not. He had held the last secret until the exact moment it would do the most good. then given it away, and asked for nothing. He went quietly in his corner, with the warmth of a stone at his back. And Nora set a piece of red sandstone at the head of his resting place. Large, flat, unmistakable. She did not carve a name into it. The stone was enough. He, of all people, would have understood that. As for the woman who had been carried up the hill to die, she did not die. Not that winter. Not for many winters after. The warm, clean, constant air that her daughter had built for her gave her lungs the one thing they had needed all along, and had never once been given in the cold cabin down in town: consistency. Year after year, the warmth held. Year after year, the cough loosened its grip. The color came back into her face. The careful, rationed movements of her worst years relaxed, slowly, into something that resembled ordinary health, and then simply became it. She grew old in the cave that was supposed to have been her grave. She knitted. She told stories. She sang her half-remembered tune to a whole generation of valley children who grew up thinking of the warm hillside home as the safest place they knew. And when she finally went at the very end of a long life, she went in a bed her daughter had built for her against the warmest stretch of the floor. Her last breath was not a cough. It was the opening notes of that old, plain melody, hummed into the warm and quiet air. And then, stillness. She had come to that hill with a doctor's warning folded around her like a shroud. She left it decades later, having outlived every forecast, having saved a child's life on the worst night the valley ever knew, having become the grandmother of a place that had once tried to throw her away. That was the thing the town never quite had words for. They had handed a dying widow a grave, and she had turned it into a home she lived in for the rest of her days. Nora did not leave the valley. She grew from the girl who had swung a pickaxe into frozen ground on a cold morning into a woman, and from a woman into the kind of elder that small places produce only rarely and value beyond measure. The person who has proven, through cost and craft and the particular grace of surviving what she was not meant to survive, that she understands something fundamental about how things endure. Her voice, when she used it, carried more weight than any official word, not because she had gathered authority in any formal sense. Her kind of authority could not be gathered. It could only be demonstrated, once, at great expense, in a way that the people who saw it never forgot. Long after, a traveler passed through the valley and stopped at the store. The man behind the counter was lean and careful, with watchful eyes and shelves organized with the precision of a kind of devotion. The traveler asked about the strange houses, the ones built into the hillsides, the ones that stayed warm in the deep of winter without a fire roaring at their center. The man behind the counter pointed him toward the old records, and in the records, the traveler found a journal, leather-bound, the cover worn smooth at the corners, the pages filled, margin to margin, with a precise and angular hand and diagrams of a kind he did not fully understand. The final page held a single line, written in the same careful hand as everything before it, but in ink that had dried with a slightly different pressure. The pressure of a man writing the most important thing he believed he would ever write, and wanting the letters to hold. The tree fights the wind and breaks. The mountain does not fight the cold. It gathers the warmth of the sun and remembers it through the dark. Be the mountain. The traveler closed the journal, and he sat for a long moment in the warm room, feeling, through the soles of his boots, the gentle and constant heat rising from the stone beneath the floor. He thought about the kind of person who could write such a line, who could find in the plain physics of heat moving through rock a whole philosophy for how to survive being alive, who could love so completely that the love outlasted him and arrived, decades later, in the form of warm floors and healed lungs and a valley full of homes that did not fight the winter, but simply outwaited it. Then the traveler stood, and he walked out into the clear, cold air. On the hillside to the north, above the clustered rooftops, a thin wisp of warmth rose from a small stone column, barely visible against the pale slope. The chimney still standing, still doing its patient work at the far end of a long run of buried stone. And in the window of the door, set into the rock, a warm light glowed. Not the urgent brightness of something burning against the dark, the steady, unhurried light of something that has been tended for a long time and expects, quietly, to go on being tended. Someone was home. The mountain remembered, and it always would.